Most people believe strength announces itself loudly. They expect it to arrive wearing confidence, success, and recognition. But real strength almost never does. Instead, it hides. It blends into routine. It wakes up early, goes to work, pays bills, endures silence, and carries invisible weight. Look closely at the world, and you'll notice something unsettling. History's strongest individuals often lived the most ordinary lives until life demanded something extraordinary from them. The universe does not crown its warriors in advance. It disguises them, tests them, shapes them in quiet places where no one is watching. Today, we explore why the universe hides its strongest warriors in ordinary lives, and why that ordinary life you may be living could be the training ground for something far greater. Human development rarely unfolds beneath applause. Praise can warm the surface of a person, but it does little to reshape the inner structure. What truly alters a human being is pressure, the slow, persistent kind that offers no immediate reward. Resistance, delay, and unanswered effort push the psyche inward, where it must either fragment or organize itself around something deeper than approval. When a person is not constantly affirmed, they are compelled to ask a more difficult question. Who am I when no one is watching? That question, though uncomfortable, becomes the beginning of real strength. In obscurity, the outer mirrors disappear. There is no crowd to reflect identity back to us, no applause to confirm worth. And so the individual turns inward, not by choice, but by necessity. This inward turn is not gentle. It forces confrontation with doubt, fear, inadequacy, and longing. Yet it is precisely here that an internal compass begins to form. Instead of moving toward what is praised, the person learns to move toward what feels true. Instead of acting to be seen, they act to remain whole. This shift from external validation to internal orientation is one of the most important psychological transformations a human being can undergo. Modern research on resilience quietly supports what experience has long suggested. Individuals who endure prolonged but manageable adversity often develop stronger emotional regulation, patience, and endurance over time. When struggle is not catastrophic but persistent, it teaches the nervous system how to remain steady under strain. The psyche adapts. It learns how to wait without collapsing, how to continue without recognition. This capacity cannot be learned in environments where effort is instantly rewarded. It is learned where effort must sustain itself. Consider the teacher who enters the same classroom year after year, long after youthful idealism has faded. There are no headlines for such devotion, no public ceremonies for shaping unseen futures. Yet over time, this quiet repetition builds something rare: steadiness. The teacher learns to give without guarantee, to invest without certainty, to care without control over outcomes. Or consider the factory worker whose days are defined by monotony. To an outsider, the life appears small. But within that repetition, patience is trained, discipline is hardened, and self-control becomes second nature. These are not glamorous virtues, but they are foundational. They are the kind of inner muscles that do not fail when conditions become hostile. Obscurity strips life of distraction. When no one is watching, the performance ends. There is no audience to impress, no image to maintain. What remains is the raw relationship between the individual and their task, between effort and meaning. This is where character is slowly assembled. In silence, a person discovers whether they will abandon themselves when reward is absent, or whether they can remain loyal to an inner standard that no one else can see. That loyalty, repeated over time, becomes integrity, not as a moral pose, but as psychological alignment. Strength that depends on applause is fragile because it is borrowed. The moment recognition fades, motivation collapses. But strength formed in silence is self-generating. It does not require permission to exist. It grows because it must. The universe, in its quiet intelligence, understands this difference. It does not entrust real power to those who need to be seen to function. Instead, it allows potential to mature in the shadows, where ego is not constantly fed and where humility naturally develops. There is a reason so many individuals who later carry great responsibility often emerge from unremarkable beginnings. Their inner world has been conditioned to withstand neglect, misunderstanding, and delay. They have already lived without affirmation, so its absence does not weaken them. They have already faced invisibility, so being unseen does not feel like annihilation. In this way, obscurity becomes preparation rather than punishment. To be hidden is not to be forgotten. It is to be spared premature exposure. Just as seeds germinate underground, human strength requires darkness before it can tolerate light. When effort continues without applause, when values persist without validation, something durable takes shape. The soul learns to stand on its own. And when pressure eventually comes, as it always does, this kind of strength does not panic. It has already been forged where no one was clapping, where quitting would have gone unnoticed, and where continuing meant answering only to oneself. An ordinary life rarely feels meaningful while it is being lived. It feels repetitive, predictable, and at times unbearably dull. Yet repetition is not the enemy of growth. It is its most faithful instructor. The human psyche is not transformed by grand moments alone, but by the quiet rhythm of daily demands that ask the same question again and again. Will you govern yourself, or will you be governed by impulse? Each ordinary day presents this question in subtle forms, and how one answers it shapes the inner world far more than dramatic events ever could. Waking up when the body resists, when motivation is absent and comfort whispers seductively, is not a trivial act. It is a small confrontation with the instinctual self that seeks ease and avoidance. Showing up to responsibilities when no one is watching, when no reward is promised and no praise is given, requires an inner authority. Choosing restraint when expression or indulgence would feel easier demands a kind of quiet courage. These acts appear insignificant, but they are repetitions, and repetition engraves pathways in the mind and soul. Neuroscience now confirms what human experience has long suggested. When an individual repeatedly delays gratification, the structures in the brain responsible for discipline, foresight, and emotional regulation grow stronger. Over time, the capacity to pause, reflect, and choose wisely becomes more natural. This biological truth mirrors a psychological one. Self-mastery is not inherited, nor is it discovered suddenly. It is trained patiently and often painfully through the same small decisions made over and over again. Consider the single parent navigating exhaustion, financial strain, and emotional responsibility simultaneously. There is little room for dramatic self-expression. Life demands regulation of emotion, of desire, of fear. Each day requires choices that place long-term survival above immediate relief. The child must be fed, the work must be done, the emotions must be contained. From the outside, this life may appear ordinary, even invisible. But inwardly, it is a relentless discipline, a continuous shaping of the will. Such a person becomes intimately familiar with sacrifice, not as a moral concept, but as a lived reality. Or consider the immigrant who arrives in an unfamiliar land, carrying uncertainty, memory, and hope in equal measure. Language barriers, cultural displacement, and economic hardship press constantly against the psyche. Fear must be managed, frustration restrained, pride swallowed. To endure, the individual must govern their reactions carefully. Impulse would lead to despair or rage, but restraint becomes a survival skill. Over time, this restraint forms an inner strength that cannot be taught in comfort. It arises because chaos makes discipline necessary. These lives rarely look heroic because heroism is often mistaken for spectacle. True self-mastery is silent. It occurs in moments no one documents, in decisions no one applauds. Yet these moments accumulate. They build an inner order that remains stable even when outer circumstances fluctuate. The individual learns that feelings need not dictate action, that desire can be observed rather than obeyed, and that fear can be acknowledged without being surrendered to. The psyche, when left undisciplined, becomes fragmented, pulled in many directions by impulse, emotion, and reaction. Ordinary life, with its constraints and repetitions, quietly offers a remedy. It imposes limits. It demands routine. It forces prioritization. In doing so, it teaches the individual how to organize the inner world. This organization is not rigid, but resilient. It allows one to act deliberately rather than react blindly. The universe, in its subtle wisdom, does not grant external power to those who cannot yet govern themselves. Mastery of circumstance without mastery of the self leads to destruction, both inward and outward. History provides countless examples of individuals who gained influence before developing inner restraint, only to be undone by their own unchecked impulses. Power magnifies what already exists within. If chaos reigns inside, it will inevitably manifest outside. Thus, ordinary lives become training grounds. They are the places where impulse is tamed, where patience is strengthened, where foresight is learned through necessity. Those who endure these quiet disciplines often emerge capable of navigating far greater challenges later, not because they are extraordinary, but because they have learned how to command themselves. And this command, once established, does not depend on circumstances. It travels with the individual wherever life leads, steady and unannounced, like a strength that does not need to be seen to be real. Invisibility is often experienced as rejection, yet psychologically it can be a form of protection. When recognition arrives too early, identity swells before it has been properly shaped. The individual begins to confuse attention with worth, applause with meaning. What should have been a slow construction of character becomes an inflated image, fragile and dependent on constant reinforcement. The psyche, still unprepared for weight, is asked to carry a crown before the spine has strengthened. When strength becomes visible too soon, ego naturally steps forward to claim ownership. Ego seeks affirmation, comparison, and control. It feeds on being seen and fears being forgotten. In its early stages, ego is not evil, it is simply immature. But when it is over before the deeper self has developed, it becomes tyrannical. It demands constant validation and reacts defensively to criticism. Growth then slows, not because potential is absent, but because attention has replaced effort as the primary source of motivation. Psychological research into what is often called gifted burnout reveals a quiet tragedy. Individuals praised excessively for talent or intelligence early in life frequently struggle later when sustained effort, failure, or patience is required. Their identity has been built around being exceptional rather than becoming capable. When admiration fades, as it inevitably does, their inner foundation collapses. Without applause, they feel empty. Without recognition, they feel lost. The early light, meant to encourage, has instead blinded them to the discipline required for maturity. By contrast, those who remain unseen are spared this distortion. Without constant feedback, they are forced to answer to something deeper than approval. They must ask themselves what matters when no one is clapping. Values begin to replace image. Purpose begins to replace performance. The individual learns to tolerate anonymity, and in doing so, learns to tolerate themselves. This tolerance is not passive resignation. It is a quiet strengthening of identity rooted in meaning rather than attention. Consider the artist who works for years in obscurity. Each creation is an act of faith, not rewarded by recognition but sustained by inner necessity. Doubt accompanies every step. There are moments when the work feels meaningless, when abandonment seems rational. Yet if the artist continues, something profound occurs. The work becomes an extension of the inner life rather than a plea for validation. When recognition eventually arrives, it does not define the artist. It merely meets someone who already knows who they are. Or consider the entrepreneur who fails repeatedly in private. Each failure strips away illusion. Pride is humbled, assumptions are challenged, and patience is forced to grow. There is no audience to impress, no reputation to protect, only reality remains. Through this process, decision-making sharpens, resilience develops, and humility becomes practical rather than theoretical. Success, when it finally comes, rests on experience rather than fantasy. Power is carried, not flaunted. Invisibility teaches a crucial psychological lesson. Being unseen does not equal being unreal. The self exists even without reflection. This realization stabilizes identity. When external mirrors disappear, the individual must learn to see themselves from within. This inner vision is slower to develop, but far more reliable. It is not shaken by opinion, nor inflated by praise. It grows through consistency, reflection, and confrontation with one's own limitations. The universe appears to understand something the ego resists: power without humility becomes destructive. History repeatedly demonstrates that individuals who acquire influence before developing inner restraint often misuse it, harming both themselves and others. Humility is not weakness, it is accurate self-perception. It allows one to recognize limits, learn from failure, and remain open to correction. Invisibility cultivates this humility naturally, without moral instruction. It simply removes the conditions that feed arrogance. A quiet soul, shaped away from the spotlight, learns to listen rather than dominate. It learns to wait rather than demand. It learns to act from understanding rather than impulse. When such a soul is eventually called into visibility, it does not collapse under attention nor become intoxicated by praise. It remains anchored. Power in its hands does not inflate the ego, because the ego has already learned its proper place. Thus, being hidden is not a delay of destiny, but a refinement of it. The strongest individuals are often those who learn to live without recognition long before they were trusted with influence. Their strength does not announce itself. It does not need to. It has been tempered by silence, protected by invisibility, and guided by a humility that ensures whatever power they hold will serve rather than consume. Pain that is witnessed often seeks expression, explanation, and sometimes justification. Pain that is unseen, however, behaves differently. It turns inward. It becomes reflective rather than performative. When suffering unfolds without an audience, there is no stage upon which to dramatize it, no immediate validation to soften its impact. The individual is left alone with the experience, forced to make meaning rather than spectacle. This quiet confrontation with pain reshapes the inner world in ways that visible suffering rarely does. In ordinary lives, pain arrives without ceremony. Loss occurs without public acknowledgement. Rejection passes without commentary. Failure settles in without applause or condemnation. Loneliness becomes a companion rather than an event. Because there is no audience, the individual cannot externalize the pain easily. They must learn to carry it internally. This carrying, repeated over time, teaches something profoundly rare: how to feel deeply without hardening the heart. Many people, when hurt, turn their pain outward and allow it to become cruelty. But those who suffer in silence often learn restraint, because expressing pain destructively would only multiply it. Psychological research consistently reveals that individuals who have endured deep, prolonged suffering tend to develop heightened emotional intelligence. They become more attuned to subtle emotional signals, more capable of perspective taking, and more patient with the vulnerabilities of others. This is not because suffering automatically ennobles, but because those who survive it without collapsing have learned the internal language of pain. They recognize it in others not as a concept, but as a lived reality. Their empathy is not theoretical, it is embodied. Consider the nurse who spends long hours tending to suffering bodies and anxious minds. Often, their own emotional burdens remain unseen. They witness grief, fear, and death regularly, yet must maintain composure and presence. Over time, this repeated exposure to human vulnerability deepens their capacity for compassion. They learn how to offer care without becoming overwhelmed, how to remain gentle without becoming fragile. Their strength is quiet, expressed not through dominance but through steadiness. Or consider the caregiver who sacrifices personal ambition to support a loved one. The world may not recognize this devotion. There are no awards for endurance, no public acknowledgement for patience. Yet within this life, empathy is forged daily. The caregiver learns to anticipate needs, to listen without impatience, to act without resentment. These qualities are not learned in comfort. They arise from sustained contact with another's suffering, carried privately and persistently. Even the quiet neighbor, who has endured loss without announcement, often carries an emotional depth invisible to those around them. Their kindness is not performative. It is measured, intentional, and sincere. When they offer understanding, it does not come from obligation, but from recognition. They have been where pain lives. They know its weight, and so they approach others with care, not because they seek praise, but because they understand the cost of indifference. The ability to hold pain without becoming cruel is one of the most powerful psychological achievements. It requires the individual to metabolize suffering rather than transmit it. This process transforms pain into insight, vulnerability into wisdom. Such individuals do not deny hardship, nor do they romanticize it. They accept it as part of the human condition and, in doing so, become capable of meeting others without judgment. Leadership rooted in empathy emerges from this soil. Unlike leadership driven by dominance or image, empathetic leadership seeks understanding before control. It recognizes that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to remain open despite it. Studies in organizational psychology show that leaders who demonstrate empathy foster greater trust, resilience, and cooperation within groups. These leaders often come from backgrounds marked by adversity, where understanding others was not optional, but necessary for survival. The universe appears to entrust its most demanding roles to those who have learned to suffer without spectacle. Such individuals do not require constant affirmation, because their sense of worth is not dependent on external validation. They have already carried weight without recognition. They have already learned to endure without being applauded. As a result, they can support others without needing to be supported by praise. In this way, ordinary pain becomes extraordinary preparation. It teaches the heart how to remain soft in a hard world, how to offer understanding without condescension, and how to lead without dominating. Those shaped by unseen suffering often move quietly through life, yet when others falter, they are the ones who step forward, not to be seen, but to help carry the load. Their strength lies not in being celebrated, but in being capable of holding others when no one is watching. Within every human being there exists a reservoir of unrealized capacity, a silent accumulation of instincts, insights, and strengths that remain dormant until circumstances demand their emergence. Most people mistake potential for something dramatic, something that announces itself early and loudly. Yet the psyche does not unfold in this manner. Its deepest preparations occur quietly, beyond conscious awareness, in the unremarkable routines of daily life. What appears to be stagnation is often incubation. What feels like delay is frequently design. History reveals this pattern again and again. Individuals who later alter the course of events often begin as ordinary figures, indistinguishable from those around them. A clerk, surrounded by paperwork and routine, discovers a voice that eventually challenges systems far larger than himself. A prisoner, confined and stripped of external freedom, turns inward and emerges with insights that reshape how others understand suffering and meaning. An unknown citizen, living far from the center of power, becomes a symbol of resistance, not because they sought greatness, but because circumstance awakened something that had been quietly forming all along. These individuals were not selected for their extraordinariness. They were shaped by their ordinariness. Their lives, before transformation, offered little evidence of what they would become. Yet during those years, something essential was taking place beneath the surface. Depth psychology teaches that the unconscious mind is constantly at work, integrating experiences, storing impressions, and forging connections long before the conscious mind recognizes their value. The unconscious does not hurry. It prepares patiently, using repetition, frustration, and uncertainty as tools of development. Every delay carries information. When progress slows or stops, the psyche is often being asked to deepen rather than advance. Disappointments force reflection. Detours introduce perspectives that would otherwise remain inaccessible. These experiences, though painful, enrich the unconscious with material that later becomes insight, courage, or moral clarity. What feels like wasted time is often the period during which the inner structure necessary for future action is being assembled. Ordinary life provides the perfect environment for this preparation, because it is largely unobserved. Without the pressure of expectation, the unconscious can experiment, adapt, and grow without interference from ego or image. The individual learns through living rather than performing. Mistakes are made privately. Lessons are absorbed slowly. Identity forms organically rather than being imposed prematurely. This quiet formation is crucial. Power that emerges before the psyche is ready often destabilizes the individual, but power that arises from a well-prepared unconscious is carried with steadiness and purpose. Consider how often people feel frustration with their own lives, sensing that something within them remains unused. This feeling is not evidence of failure. It is often evidence of preparation. The tension between who one is and who one might become generates energy. When endured consciously rather than avoided, this tension fuels growth. The unconscious uses this friction to refine instinct, strengthen intuition, and clarify values. Over time, the individual becomes more attuned to their inner signals, even if they cannot yet articulate them. The unknown citizen who later becomes a symbol of resistance does not suddenly acquire courage. That courage has been practiced in small ways long before it is tested publicly. It appears in moments of quiet integrity, in decisions to remain honest when dishonesty would be easier, in the refusal to abandon one's values despite inconvenience. These acts rarely attract attention, yet they train the psyche to stand firm when pressure intensifies. When the moment arrives, the individual does not invent strength, they remember it. The unconscious prepares through accumulation rather than revelation. It gathers fragments of experience, conversations, failures, longings, and arranges them into patterns that only later become visible. When life finally demands action, these patterns surface as clarity, resolve, or vision. What seems like sudden transformation is, in truth, delayed recognition. The work was done long before it was noticed. The universe appears to respect this psychological rhythm. It does not rush revelation because premature exposure can fracture what is still forming. Instead, it allows individuals to live ordinary lives where their inner capacities can mature without distortion. When they are finally called into roles of influence or resistance, they respond not with confusion, but with a sense of inevitability. They feel, often with surprise, that they have been preparing for this moment without knowing its name. To live an ordinary life with awareness is to participate consciously in this preparation. It means paying attention to inner movements, honoring small acts of integrity, and trusting that nothing experienced with depth is ever wasted. The strongest individuals are not those who escape ordinariness, but those who inhabit it fully, allowing it to shape them. When they are finally revealed, their strength does not astonish them. It feels familiar, as though it has been waiting patiently, formed in silence, until the world was ready to meet it. If your life feels unnoticed, if your efforts feel unseen, if your strength feels wasted on routine, understand this: the universe does not hide weakness. It hides power until it can be trusted. You are not overlooked. You are being trained. And when the moment arrives, when life demands courage, depth, and endurance, those who lived quietly, patiently, and consciously will rise, not because they sought greatness, but because greatness was quietly being built within them all along.